And here we are.
Yeah.
So this is episode 3. We missed a week. That was my fault. I'm sorry. So got the Rona and basically ended up sleeping. I got over reasonably quickly, but I ended up sleeping quite a couple of weekends away, really. So as a result of that, we sort of missed out on one of our regular scheduled recordings. So it's a week late anyway.
Right. Well, as long as you're feeling better and, you got the rest you needed.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'm fine now. Yeah. So it's interesting though. Yeah, well, I didn't get it too badly, but I said I'm just quite fatigued there for a while.
Right. Well, a lot of friends of mine have had corona, and I guess it's probably just is it really like a bad cold, or is it kind of worse? Or
yeah, for me it was it felt a little different to other viruses I've had in terms of I was quite sort of almost like a disturbance in my throat where even water would cause me to end up in coughing fits and all sorts of things. So it felt a little different. It was just a bit strange in some ways, but I think I only had it for about 3 or 4 days, really.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think there's one instance in my life that I think I might have had it, but I'm not sure. I've never been diagnosed with it once, I think, but my wife thinks that we both had at one point in which we had no real appetite for days, basically. And I don't even really remember those days, but she thinks that might have been when we had it. And we've gone over it, and we've probably been naturally immunized, and I don't think either of us have had it since. So if we did have it.
We know even for people who are being tested that the false negative rate early on was quite high. And apparently even they're saying even now again it's quite high again because of all the variations that are in sort of in the wild. And so the rapid antigen tests will be set up to sort of detect the most common ones, and some other mutation will occur and it'll miss it. So there's probably lots of people out there who have had it and didn't know it.
Yeah, that sounds likely. I'm pretty sure I've been immunized by exposing myself to the elements, because I was, where, there was this one period where we were more required to do a mask just about anywhere we went. That was kind of a helpless situation. But once the mandates got lifted, we flouted that. We just did not wear a mask, and we, we didn't care what anyone thought of us. We just went out there and just, here we are, and we probably just got immunized from that. So.
Yeah, well, that's right, exactly. Yeah, and there's always been a fair proportion of people who are asymptomatic anyway, so they get it, and
yeah, to be sure,
would hardly notice, maybe a bit tired or whatever, and maybe a few days they'd be fine.
Right. Yes. All right. So we left off wanting to talk about some more feminist quotes. We ended last time talking about feminist quotes, and I think we got some more to lead into before we get into some other things we want to talk to today. So exactly,
we've got plenty of feminist quotes, but yeah, you mentioned Mona Eltahawy. I think we'd started talking about her, but yeah, I think we were going to sort of chat about her a little bit more. Right. So Mona Eltahawy is an Egyptian American. She describes herself, interestingly, as a secular radical feminist Muslim. So I'm not quite sure what a secular Muslim would be, given that one who professes the Islamic faith would, I think, perhaps not be secular. But anyway, yes, so that's how she sees herself. And she openly promotes violence against men. She so she came to Australia. This is really when she sort of came onto my radar. I don't know if I had actually run across her before this, but she came to Australia in 2019 to speak at a feminist conference called the Broadside Conference, which I think, from memory, that was the first year they were actually launching that conference, and their plan was to run it as an annual conference. Obviously, their plans were derailed like everyone else's, but I think that the Broadside Conference has actually gone ahead again in the last year or so. Anyway, this was the 2019 conference, and Mona was here to speak at the conference, but while she was here, she was invited on Australian TV. There's a very influential TV show called Q&A, It's on a government-run TV station. And so it's not there, they don't have any advertisements. It's all government funded. It's called the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And she was on Q&A along with a number of other people who were speaking at this Broadside conference. And they openly they openly called for violence against men. And also, too, interestingly enough, they openly talked about defunding the police. Now, this was before Seattle. So I think it gives you an indication of sort of the thought processes that were going on within feminism there, because we're talking sort of 12, 18 months before the events in Seattle, and you already had feminists talking about defunding the police. Now, what was another feminist who did that, but Mona Eltahawy also backed up that statement, supported that idea. But anyway, yeah, she openly called for violence against men. She goes around doing this quite a bit, and is never called to account for it.
What's she doing now? Just the same old.
Right, same old. Yeah, I've kept an eye on what she's been up to. She's been interviewed on a few different stations. I think Al Jazeera interviewed her one day not so long ago. And there've been a few different interviews, and I've generally watched a few. There was a British museum actually that brought her in and interviewed her within the last year or so. So yeah, she's going around sort of on the I guess you can say the presentation circuit, trying to keep herself relevant and so forth. But yeah, she's out there. I think if anything, it proves the privilege of feminists that they can go around openly calling for violence against a gender, and nothing will happen.
Well, so you say that she's a secular radical feminist Muslim. So the secular Muslim contradiction aside, what is it with the feminist and far left fixation with Islam?
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because you could certainly argue in some countries, Islamic law has got quite strict rules about women. Now, of course, that's probably only a minority of Islamic countries. Saudi Arabia comes to mind, obviously, where until recently women couldn't drive. They are allowed to drive now, I understand, and there are a few other things that were going on. Iran's an interesting case. Iran has had since the revolution, has had some strict rules around the behaviour of women, but of course it's also got strict rules about the behaviour of men. Yeah. But at the same time, Iran reserves a certain number of seats in its parliament for women. So it's really quite interesting that. And I believe there are female police officers that deal with essentially female offenders, while male police officers primarily deal with male offenders. So I think the situation, to be honest, is regarding women is fairly complex in Muslim countries. Varies a lot. There's a lot of Muslim countries, of course, where I think that women's rights aren't impinged at all. But it is interesting that feminism does seem to have this sort of fascination with Islam, doesn't it?
I wonder if it's more of that counter West attitude, I suppose. Mm-hmm. It's kind of, the dialogue has always been framed in a way of like Christians and Jews versus the Muslims, I suppose, maybe. I would just as likely say that, Muslims would consider us the more of they'll criticize us more on the basis that we're secular in comparison to the more religiously pure side. But then again, the Christians could say that about the other side. So it's a bit of a mess, I think.
And certainly some Islamic governments, for example, have really pointed the finger at the West and talked about it being morally corrupt and so forth. So, and certainly there is that line. But I think you're right there about the anti-Western attitude within feminism. And I like to point out that feminism really does exist on a continuum. You've got things like BDS, which is even an anti-Israel movement that's been out there. Feminism, various other movements on the woke side of things. I try not to mention left and right very much. Sometimes it's inevitable, unfortunately. Yeah. So I dare say, on the feminism woke left continuum. There's a few different, like Black Lives Matter is another one and many of the supporters of Black Lives Matter, of which some I know personally, are really quite sincere in their concerns. But the leadership of Black Lives Matter, I've got some real concerns about. But anyway, I do think that exists on a continuum as well. So they don't all necessarily agree with one another, but there is sort of a trend there, and it is sort of it is somewhat anti-Western, unfortunately, given that the Western civilization isn't perfect, but it's done quite, I think, better than other civilizations in terms of protecting individual rights and seeking justice. At least that's my view.
Yeah, that's absolutely fair to say. I mean, when it comes to other cultures, I think the potential for like the individual and the want for his and her liberty is it's there. It's potential and it's sincere, but the West brings that out very effectively, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Concepts like the rule of law and so forth, which won't invest. I mean, the concept of the rule of law goes back arguably 5,000 years, but I think the West has made a genuine effort to try to make the society fair. And I think that in terms of the high standard of living we have is partly a result of that and so forth. But yes, the Western countries have certainly made mistakes along the way, as any civilization will. But overall, I think it's been very successful. And I do find the anti-Western sentiment to be really troubling. And I suspect if those people got their way, they would find that they wouldn't be happier or better off under whatever sort of society they're planning to create.
Absolutely. One thing I noticed is that it's kind of hard to discern what the criticism of the West really boils down to. Are we too like traditionalist in the religious sense, or are we too decadent? I've seen both arguments.
Yes. So. And the US is an interesting case there too. I think certainly, as I said, we've talked about this before, and I'm an outsider looking in. I lived in Canada for 8 years and traveled to the US often, so I had an opportunity to see the country and look at it sort of from that outside view, if you like. It's interesting that I do think that the US has quite a strong religious segment that is probably absent in most other wealthy Western countries, like here in Australia, for example, or Canada. There isn't really a strong religious vote that's significant. There are obviously lots of religious people, but they're not, I guess perhaps they're not organised enough or coherent enough, internally coherent enough to wield that power. And in the UK, I've only been in the UK a couple of times, but my impression there is that it's pretty much the same. That yes, there's obviously a religious segment, but they don't seem to wield the power that they do in the US. That's my view anyway, or that's what seems to me that in the US there is this segment in society which is quite religious, and it's able to wield political power, and it is at odds with the increasingly secular Western outlook, as it were. And I think that's an interesting thing to the US, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you were really wanting to talk about bachelor tax today, so I think we should jump right into that.
Yes. So this is, oddly enough, I was just thinking about what we might want to talk about today, and I just happened to, a discussion came up on one of our internal men's rights groups, discussing potential concerns down the road of laws that might be imposed upon men down the road, including, for example, concerns as the population continues to decline. There's increasing concerns about whether the state may start asserting even more control over sperm and so forth. But at the moment, sperm in sperm banks has largely been protected from under contract law and not being seized. But could we see, if society got desperate enough, could we see men having their sperm used to father children without their consent? And we got to, this sort of topic was going on, and it reminded me of bachelor taxes that are actually a tax. A lot of people don't know this. Many societies have had bachelor taxes. They are taxes that financially punish single men for essentially not getting married and having children.
Sure.
Even the US has had them.
This sounds like a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. You get financially, completely siphoned out of your money if you do marry, because a lot of the energy goes there, and even after the divorce. But if you don't marry, then you get taxed. So
you get taxed as well. Yeah. Exactly. That's right.
Yeah. This sounds like. Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, some of them go back quite. There's they go back. Some of them go back to ancient Rome, for example. But we've seen them even within the 20th century.
And no one calls this out, huh? I mean, there's our circles, but
Yeah, otherwise, no. It's really interesting, actually. So it would be as the birth rate continues to decline. Yeah, as I was saying before, there'll be a real question about whether this, about the extent to which we start to see these explicitly coming out. Now, I did want to mention one thing, though, and this was actually something that's been pointed out by others, that combined tax returns for married couples or for couples that are in a permanent relationship is itself a form of bachelor tax or single tax for in those societies. So if you have, as a lot of societies have done this, and they will essentially treat the married couple as one financial unit and give them, say, tax bars that are twice as wide as they would be for a single person. The married couple are much better off tax-wise than two individuals would be. And some people have pointed out that this is a kind of bachelor tax implicitly, because it basically makes it much more financially preferable for people to be in relationships and to be married.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, I personally admit that, that's the direction we've gone in terms of the practical matters, my wife and myself. So.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, in this case, I think it's, oh, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. That's all right.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we lead us into a discussion about taxes in general? It's just one thing that we like to talk about here in the men's movement is the fact that it is, in essence, when it comes to taxes in general, men are the ones that, on the whole, pay more, while women are more the beneficiaries. So can you add some more input on that?
Yeah, no worries. So there was an interesting article. It actually does appear on A Voice for Men. That's not the original site, but we do have a copy on A Voice for Men. And it was an analysis, or New Zealand conducted a major analysis of its taxation system. And this was probably going back about 10 years now. And while it's specific to New Zealand, it does relate more generally, at least to other Western countries and to a lesser extent other countries as well. And what they found was that men were generally revenue neutral. And in New Zealand, women were costing the state about 150,000 New Zealand dollars more than they were contributing to the system. And this is consistent with other research that's shown that the bulk of taxation is essentially paid by men. And there's a variety of reasons for that. The men tend to work longer hours. They tend to work more years, and they as we've said before, they tend to choose jobs that pay more over a job they're more likely to enjoy. They tend to more likely to choose a job that pays more over a job that's closer to them, so they have a shorter commute and so forth. So they end up in the situation where they have higher pay, which of course feminists then complain about and talk about the pay gap.
Of course.
But you've got men working up to 50 years now full time. During that time, they're becoming more senior in a profession. They are getting a larger wage, and they're paying a higher proportion of the tax. But men are much less likely to draw back on the system, which comes back to what New Zealand found about the men being essentially revenue neutral. So women, for example, use health services significantly more than men do. And that's really interesting when you consider that men continue to have a lower life expectancy and have higher rates of mortality at every age.
It's interesting that you mentioned, what was it? That whole complaint about the wage gap and stuff like that.
Tied in.
It's like the type of labor and the quality of labor doesn't matter. All it matters is the hours. Pay us equal based on the hours logged in. I think that's the mentality of the feminists.
Yeah, that's right. Now, and one of the tricks they do is, of course, they just look at very broad comparisons of men and women in professions, without looking at things like seniority and so forth, and various other characteristics that various other aspects that will result in a pay difference, like willingness to tendency to work full time versus part time and so forth. And as I pointed out, we can't explain women working part time just from child rearing anymore, because here in Australia the birth rate is 1.58 births per woman. So women aren't spending very long on average having children. And the US is a bit higher actually than most other developed countries. But even now, I think it's dropped below 2.1, which is replacement level. And so you end up with women only being in the workforce for, we're only being out of the workforce for a few years having kids. And that alone can't explain much of the difference, a little bit. Yeah, so there's more going on. There's women choosing to work part-time for very long periods of their career and accruing much less wealth in terms of ability to retire as well.
Could you give me the actual links to the studies about the tax thing where men pay more, women rake in just as much?
Yes, exactly. So let me see if I can find it right now. I'm pretty on the computer.
Yeah, or whenever you got the chance. Yeah, because I think those things will be important because speaking as a libertarian myself, libertarians like to talk about how taxation is theft and and it's causing a problem with liberty and such. But this particular angle was never touched on because they just don't seem to want to admit that there's an anti-male problem, and this is not by any means unique to libertarianism at all. Virtually every political viewpoint is guilty of this. But speaking again as a libertarian myself, I think this is something that they need to actually bring attention to. Absolutely. And
you're right. Most political groups seem to really they're too afraid of it, aren't they? It's really hands off. They'll go to a certain point, but then they won't cross that line and start talking about this. So we've got a libertarian group, political party in Australia called the Liberal Democratic Party. Now, to be clear, they are completely separate to the Liberal Democratic Party in the UK. Yes. It's often unfortunate. One unfortunate thing you see is political parties with the same name in countries that usually, if you see that, apart from the Greens, maybe they're not very similar usually. So, the Liberal Democratic Party in Australia is a libertarian party, and interestingly enough, so they actually helped organise the March for Men back in 2018, which was a major event here. Yep, and many of the people who I spoke at that event, and many of the people who were on the foot soldiers making the whole thing happen were actually members of the Liberal Democratic Party in Australia, and they set aside their personal time to come along and support us. So the Liberal Democratic Party has a fairly strong, maybe non-feminist, if not anti-feminist, streak to it, and to a certain extent. I'd say it's probably a group or a faction within the party have been willing to step up on that. There are probably other people in the party who aren't quite so sure about that, but certainly at least some of the members of the LDP have been really quite happy to be vocal about that, and so they were behind. They helped to organise a March for Men.
Up to this point in the United States, I think the Libertarian Party has been trying to do its very best to attract the women, I suppose. Yeah. They talk the talk about them having been in the forefront of women's rights and such, right? So they're really trying to get to appeal to the women here, and it looks like they're walking on eggshells if they're even aware of the fact that there's been many injustices towards men, often at the behest of women, in the context of the liberty and tyranny discussion.
And they're really concerned about alienating that voter base. Absolutely. Yeah,
to be sure.
And that's quite a problem. And I would like to see them obviously step up, but I can see why they are concerned, because they probably would, in all honesty, alienate quite a substantial portion of their voter base. It's interesting. We haven't seen any mainstream political parties really step up on men's issues to a large degree. As I said, the Liberal Democratic Party in Australia has done, but it's been more, apart from the March for Men, it's mostly been informal. You don't see, for example, LDP senators here talking specifically about issues of feminism. I will say there was one senator for the Liberal Democratic Party by the name of David Leyonhjelm. Now, he actually was, I think, the leader of the party at the time. He was actually pretty good. Again, he wasn't specifically coming out and sort of criticising feminism, but he was really good at calling them out on some of their claims. And it was quite fun to watch. And you can see these videos, a number of them online. And David Leyonhjelm will just start querying their claims about the pay gap or, various other things. And I don't know if you have the same terminology there, but invariably they would say, we have to take that question on notice. And that means they don't know and they need to go away and try to find out. And then they would have to come back. And that's in something called Senate estimates, where they will, where the senators can basically quiz these, government bodies and so forth and ask them questions. And yes, they've got the opportunity to admit they don't know right now, but they have to come back. Every question is on notice, is recorded, and they have to come back and explain it to give an answer to the senator. And it's really interesting, actually, how they sort of try to dodge around some of the questions. So perhaps it's probably worth. I think we might even post a few of these videos on A Voice for Men, actually.
I think that would be a good idea, to be true.
Yeah, exactly. It'd be quite good to see them. Some of them are quite amusing.
Right. Yep. And this is not to say that there isn't some kind of pushback towards the feminist norms, but I think there needs to be more education for them with regards to the true extent of how far back feminism really goes with the nonsense. It was based, as we like to say in the men's movement, feminism was never not rotten, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's still some people that go, it had a noble purpose. At first, it was really about equality, but then it went into a bad direction. Now,
lost its way or something.
Right. Yeah, lost its way. Good grief.
Exactly. That's right.
Well, yeah. I mean,
and to be honest, we've got a lot of sort of, I actually call them allies, or say, and that's great. At least they recognise modern feminism is a problem. But yes, the reality is that when you start really digging back into the feminist movement, it's exactly. I don't think there was never a time when it wasn't wrong, as you say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
I was going to say, going right back to the Declaration of Sentiments, actually.
Yes. Yeah.
In 1848, which a lot of people don't know that.
Yeah,
that was really the establishment of modern feminism, the Seneca Falls Convention.
Yeah, let's talk more about that. Yeah, let's talk more about that. The Seneca Falls Convention.
Right, so the Seneca Falls Convention, 1848. There were 300 delegates that went to the convention. Not all women. There was actually a very prominent male emancipationist for slavery, a slavery advocate. Whose name I've forgotten, Douglas. I can't think of his first name.
Frederick Douglass?
I think it may have been Frederick Douglass, yes. So he was there, actually. So there were a number of men, but there were a majority of women. Thank you very much, but I think it was Frederick Douglass. Yeah. There were a number of men there, but mostly women. Anyway, they drew up a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, which, if you read it, kind of just it lists about sort of 20, there's a bit of other sort of stuff going on, but there's about 20 items where they just basically criticize men for various things that they claim men are doing to women. Anyway, this is the middle of the 19th century. Notably, and this is not often talked about enough, I think, only 100, it was exactly 100 of the 300 delegates signed it. So only 1/3 of the people there who made the effort to go to the convention signed it. So 200 people were found it to be unacceptable, which I think is something that is not enough is made of that, actually. But anyway, the Seneca Falls Convention was really the start of it all, and the Declaration of Sentiments.
Yeah, I think this seems to be like the smoking gun of the initial misandry of early feminism.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, if you look up the Declaration of Sentiments, which Wikipedia has an article on. So he has these are some of the comments, some of the things that were on the actual sentiments. He has not ever permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise, which is really interesting because in 1848, the US still did not have universal male franchise. There was still a lot of it, and many other countries certainly didn't. And in actual fact, Australia was one of the first countries in the world to actually provide universal male franchise and universal female franchise at a state level. There were a lot of states that implemented that quite early, relatively speaking. But even then, by 1848, it still wasn't the case in Australia. It certainly wasn't the case in the UK, nor the United States. So it's actually really interesting, I think, that they make that comment.
Absolutely.
he has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she has had no voice. Well, it's the same argument. I'll repeat that. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice. But if men don't have the franchise, they didn't have the voice either. He has withheld her from rights which are given to the most ignorant and degraded men, both natives and foreigners. That's interesting. They were claiming that foreign men had more rights than American women.
Very strange.
Yeah, I would love to have sort of had an idea exactly what rights they were talking about there.
Right. Yeah, I noticed none of this is detailed. It's just like they did bad thing. He is to blame. Woman suffers. You might as well replace all this with that, right?
Exactly. Having deprived her of this first right as a citizen, the elective franchise, thereby leaving her without representation in the halls of legislation, he has oppressed her on all sides. Oh, dear me. Mm-hmm. He's oppressed her on all sides.
Show me the sides, Don't just say all sides. Just exactly. Where the side where we hurt you.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, dear. He has made her, if married in the eye of the law, civilly dead. So that's an interesting one. So they're arguing there, they're pointing out there that in law, when a woman got married, she essentially her legal status was subsumed by her husband, and that is true in Western, in common law, so essentially in the English-speaking world. But it was a double-edged sword. The woman couldn't sign a contract without her husband agreeing, but she also wasn't responsible for her own debts. Her husband was.
Right. So she could completely screw off, and he'd be blamed.
Yes, exactly. And that's happened even quite recently. I actually know an American gentleman, someone I knew in decades past. I haven't really spoken to him much in recent years, but he told me that his wife had, I think, a gambling problem or something like that. And she accrued a US $100,000 debt. Now, this is going back to the 80s or something like this. So it's a pretty substantial sum. And he actually had to get a second job and worked. She got off scot-free. She'd fled, and they went after him for the money. And he had a second job for 4 years. And basically, he put his life on hold and did nothing but work for 4 years to pay off the debt, because he was terrified that this debt would hang over him for the rest of his life. Yeah. So he just focused on paying it off. But they were able to successfully go after him for that debt. Right. And that was in the 1980s.
So she is the role of slave driver, and he is indentured servant, basically.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I see it as a double-edged sword. Yes, there are certain rights she was deprived of, but at the same time, she also had additional protections, which is kind of the position I argue in the Victorian fallacy in my book. Essentially, what I'm arguing is that what societies did was really produce distinct legal gender roles, and that they were balanced. Yes, women in some cases had more limited rights, but on the other hand, they also had additional legal protections. So you had this sort of balance going on, whereas that's what we don't have now. I think we're lacking a balance. So that's how I've sort of tended to see it anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Another one, he has taken from her all right in property, even to the wages she earns.
We've already beaten this to death,
Yeah, exactly. That's right. The only additional point I'd make is that there are plenty of examples of, it is true while the woman was married, she generally didn't dispose of her own property. In some jurisdictions, the woman's property remained separate, I understand, but the husband controlled it. So it wasn't like he just took all her property, he just managed it. But also too, there are a lot of cases of men dying a lot younger than women, particularly when they were engaging in a lot more risky behaviour. I actually just wrote an article on A Voice for Men about this exact situation. So the case of I wrote the tale of Thomas and Mary Raby, and I think that's how they pronounced it. But they were a couple who lived in the 18th century in Australia, and Thomas built up a business empire, and was one of the early wealthy men in this new colony of New South Wales in Australia. And then he travelled to India for work, as he travelled there before for his business, and he travelled there and he caught a disease, and 2 years later he died of it. And Mary took over, and she was all that stuff she just inherited, and she was the business owner then, and she purchased additional ships eventually and continued to grow the business and additional warehouses for their trading business and so forth, and she grew the business. So they talk here about her, her assets being lost, but in actual fact, in the case of Mary Raby, she ended up picking up all the assets of the husband. So,
yeah, how dandy for her.
Exactly. And what's really interesting, I talk about in this article, she's remembered now as a major figure in the early colony of New South Wales, what is now Australia, and Thomas is largely forgotten. And yet Thomas was the one who built the business up. Yes, it is true that she successfully ran it after he died and continued to grow it. But he was the one who established that business, and I think he probably deserves a little more credit, actually.
Yeah, sure, yeah. I mean, in another context, I've been critiquing traditionalist women for loving dead men. Well, we know why now.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I mean, even throughout history, men have had a lower life expectancy than women. As I said, men have higher mortality at every age. It hasn't always been as great as it is now, but they did apparently notice it. Even, I think, as far back as the 17th century in England, it was noted that if you looked over sort of 75 or 70 or so, most of the people you found were women. So one of the biggest killers of women was, of course, childbirth, pregnancy and childbirth. And so if women could survive during that period and not die in childbirth, there was a pretty decent chance that they'd make it to into their 60s and their 70s. So they'd noticed that from centuries ago, and so in a lot of cases, you did, as you do now, you did have men dying and their wives inheriting their wealth.
Yep.
And in a lot of cases, they were well set up. And like Mary Raby here, she was well set up. She had a business, eventually retired. She lived 27 years in retirement. Of her business assets. Not bad.
All right, next one.
From the sentiments?
Yeah, from the sentiments. Yep.
Yep.
Going down the list, there's a lot.
Yep. He has made her morally an irresponsible being, as she can commit many crimes with impunity. This is interesting. With impunity, provided they be done in the presence of her husband. In the covenant of marriage, she is compelled to promise obedience to her husband, he becoming to all intents and purposes her master, the law giving him power to deprive her of her liberty and to administer chastisement. So this comes back to
his fault. It's his fault.
It was his fault. So she's got legal protections he doesn't have, and it's his fault. That's extraordinary. And to be clear, I have read these before, but I'm now reading these without having read them tonight. So I don't know what the next one's going to say. I'm just reading it as we go.
Well, we should. I think this is something that we all need to kind of burn into our heads and repeat to each other so we know exactly what they said.
That's extraordinary, isn't it? She's got additional legal protections that aren't available to men, and it's his fault. I can commit a crime with impunity, and that's your fault. Wow. They even use those words, as she can commit many crimes with impunity. That's a criticism. Wow. Okay. I have additional legal protections, and I'm unhappy about it.
Right. I have no agency.
That's extraordinary. I'm sorry I haven't mentioned that more often, actually. I'm going to mention that more often.
We got to do it. Yeah.
Exactly. He has so framed the laws of divorce as to what shall be the proper causes of divorce in case of separation, to whom the guardianship of the children shall be given, as to be wholly regardless of the happiness of the women. The law in all cases going upon a false supposition of the supremacy of a man and giving all power into his hands. Right. So this is a really interesting one too. So under common law for a long time, custody of the children automatically went to men. Now, in English law, I don't know about the US, but in England, they established something called the tender years doctrine. I thought it was before the 1840s. I'm going by memory now. But so I would have thought then that the 10 years doctrine would already exist in the in England, when by the time this is being written. But the 10 years doctrine said that young children should be with their mother. And so the court switched to giving priority to mothers. So that was the point at which fathers had to then argue if they essentially justify having custody of young children. The assumption was that the mother was the fitting parent if there was a divorce. So the 10 years doctrine was abolished in common law in Australia in the 1970s. But I think, as many do, that it still appears in our courts. But I just find this really interesting. So this is ignoring the 10 years doctrine. So the US must have had something similar at some point, but I don't know much of the details.
That's something I'll have to research. I admit I'm behind on a lot of things. I'm new. So
there's so much to do. I've been at this nearly a decade, and I just lately feel like with Wiki for Men that I'm starting to sort of get sort of on top of the pile of things that I've wanted to research.
Right.
But anyway, we're getting there. But there is really so much to look into. But
by the way, in Wiki for Men, the Declaration of Sentiments is just an article stub, so it needs to be populated.
Yes, it does. You're right. There's actually a couple of thousand articles in Wiki for Men that essentially need to be populated at the moment. So if anyone's interested in anyone who's non-feminist or anti-feminist and is interested in helping to extend Wiki for Men, I really would be interested to talk to you. We do have a few editors now, but the more editors, the better. So, and we do allow a fairly substantial amount of flexibility there. I'm not going to micromanage people. I'm just happy that they're adding content. If at worst, if you write something, we might call on, that we're not sure about, we might be called upon to justify it, and we might end up putting in, maybe a couple of alternative viewpoints or something like that, which is nothing wrong with that at all in the Wiki articles. But we don't micromanage the editors. So if anyone's interested in becoming an editor for Wiki for Men, reach out to me. After depriving her of all her rights as a married woman, if single and the owner of property, he has taxed her to support a government which recognises her only when her property can be made profitable to it. Is she complaining about paying taxes? I think that
right, yeah.
Also, don't you love 19th century?
That's men's stuff. Paying taxes is men's stuff, dude.
Exactly, that's right. I think so. And the next one is he has monopolised nearly all the profitable employments, and from those she is permitted to follow, she receives but a scanty remuneration. Right, so she's complaining that women were paid less, which is true, until I think probably the 1960s when most Western countries, or all Western countries, passed laws requiring equal work for equal pay, regardless of gender. And since then, it has been illegal to pay women less, even though feminists continue to claim that that occurs regularly. Go on, Vernon.
I wasn't going to say anything.
One of the arguments that's being put forward about this is that women, and whether or not it's a good argument, I can't say, but one of the arguments that's been put forward is that women didn't have the same financial responsibilities, and so that was the argument, justification for lower pay, that a woman who was earning money was essentially doing it for herself, whereas a man who was earning money had a family to support. That was the argument. I don't think that probably excuses, equal work for equal pay, but that is one of the arguments that was put forward. So, but I think probably if someone's doing the same work, they ought to receive the same money. The next one is he closes against her all avenues to wealth and distinction, which he considers most honourable to himself. As a teacher of theology, medicine, or law, she is not known. Right. So, and jump in. I've got things to comment on all of these, or most of them, Vernon, but feel free to jump in if you've got any thoughts on these items. So this is interesting. I talk about this quite a bit in the Victorian Fallacy, my book, which I'm not plugging. No. I talk a lot about how women actually were much more active in their societies than is generally known. And a lot of what I focus on is probably political. There were a lot of queens and there were a lot of other female leaders, and I do talk a lot about that. There were, however, and actually business people is another one I talk about. So there were a lot of women in business and so forth. There were a lot of women in the trades historically. Most women worked. A lot of people don't realize this. Most women worked historically because society wasn't wealthy enough to have a lot of people not working. There were most societies did have some areas that were excluded, that women were excluded from. But even then, there were exceptions. There were women who went to university, for example, even quite early on. And I don't know if there were female doctors in Europe. I can't think of any, but there were certainly a lot of women involved in healthcare and so forth. So there were a few areas where women were excluded, and there still have been until recently with the military, for example. But women were a lot more involved in this in the societies they lived in than is generally recognised today. Now, I think from memory, I'm going from memory now, I think 18% of European monarchs over the Middle Ages were female or something like that. I wrote an article for Voice for Men years ago in which I talked about the British Isles and how during the time of Queen Elizabeth, before her, there was Queen Mary, her half-sister, also known as Bloody Mary. There was Mary, Queen of Scots. There was Lady Jane Grey, who was a pretender to the throne. There are all these women who were vying for the thrones of the British Isles in the around this time, and 17th century. And after writing the article, I found out that there were women on the thrones of as regents of Spain and Portugal too for extended periods of time in there as well. So there were a lot of other women on the thrones as well, and I said women working in business and so forth. So yes, there were a few areas that were excluded, but it was relatively small. So to a large degree, women could and did work in a wide variety of professions.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't know that there were trades were populated by women. It was a minority of people in the trades were women, but there were women so we're talking about armourers, swordsmiths, blacksmiths. These sort of guilds in the Middle Ages had women. I once read, I haven't been able to find a verification, but back in the 1980s, I read a book that argued it was just incidental to what the book was talking about, but it actually mentioned that the one of the guilds in Paris, I think it was the Swordsmiths Guild or something, had been run by a woman for a while. So the highest ranked member of the guild was actually a woman for a while. So these women worked in a wide variety, including professional areas. Yeah.
Right, and they were involved, and in these cases, they were probably very much required to prove their worth. Kind of the opposite of today, actually.
Yes, exactly. That's right. In fact, I basically said that in this recent article, basically almost word for word for that, where I basically said that and this is a point I'm making in the book too, that that's exactly right. Women were allowed to work in these fields, and when they did well, they were respected. I mean, Mary Raby, the Bank of New South Wales was founded in her house. And she was appointed as the governor of a school, which is like a custodial position, so kind of like the board of directors of a private school early in the colony's history. So you've got women who are achieving in business or in politics or whatever are given the respect that anyone would be if they've achieved. So, and this is something we see all through history. It's very different to what I call the feminist historical narrative, where they talk about women being oppressed. Because my view is that the feminists have to make this claim, because if they didn't, what are they rescuing women from? So they're claiming that women were oppressed historically, so and they're being rescued. But if women weren't being oppressed historically, then what's the point of feminism?
Right. This was, it was desperately needed by incredibly well-to-do feminist women, right? Because they were well-to-do. They were, the men, their men were out working, and they needed something to kill time.
You're right, and that's right, and they had the time and the energy to do it. Exactly. Mm-hmm. If you look at that's right. If you look at the leaders of feminism, they're actually typically in Western countries, they're typically wealthy white women. Quite frankly, yeah, that's pretty much the situation. And while we're on the topic too, actually, A lot of people, it's a bit of a diversion, but a lot of people don't know that in the US that feminism in the 1920s was very much in bed with the KKK. So not all feminists agreed with that, but the majority of them were actually supportive of the KKK, which really says something. There were, to be fair, some feminists who spoke out against that, but they were a minority.
Right. And it's my understanding that, at the time, the KKK were kind of depicting themselves. I mean, I haven't seen the film, but there's a film called Birth of a Nation, I think, that portrayed the KKK as the protagonists. And
saviors of the society, maybe.
Yeah, right. And I think somebody correct me if I'm wrong here, but it was basically to kind of protect their women from those, from the black men, basically.
Yes, exactly.
Right, yeah.
That is, and if you do look at it, that is a theme that really does come through, but it's something that we don't talk about enough. I think the fact that there is really this gendered aspect to it, which of course brings us to the case of Emmett Till. I know we're diverging a little bit again, but
yeah, sure.
Vernon, are you familiar with the case of Emmett Till? I'm not sure we've ever talked about it.
So names are kind of bad for me, but is he the one who basically kind of whistled at a woman? She basically sicked a bunch of guys to lynch him. Is that the one?
Yeah, exactly. Allegedly whistled at her. Yeah. So, and he may well have. So we don't know. But so Emmett Till was a 14-year-old African American from Chicago. And he went to the Deep South to visit some of his relatives. It was a great uncle or something along those lines, I think. And while he was there, he was in a store. And yes, the first allegation is that he whistled at the woman and maybe even said something to her about her being attractive. Later on, she claimed that he touched her. Actually, I think later on she may actually claimed he patted her on the bottom, on the bum. Or the butt, sorry, Americans would say.
No. We get it.
Yeah. But that didn't come until later. And also, too, apparently, and I only learned this recently, apparently at the time, and then this is in the 1940s, if it was a white shopkeeper and a black person came in, they didn't hand the money to the white shopkeeper. They put the money on the counter, and then the shopkeeper picked up the money. And an allegation again, which was made later, not during the initial allegations, but later, was that he put the money in her hand. And maybe he did. He was from Chicago, right? He lived in a different society, and he's come down to the Deep South. But in any case, the woman who's still alive, by the way, she essentially told some men, her husband and her, I think, half brother. And they went around to the house. And they were basically driving around town and found Emmett at the house and removed him from the house at gunpoint. Now, it's been alleged she was never. Something's come up recently about this. Both of the men were charged but acquitted by an all-white jury. But it's come up recently that an arrest warrant was actually issued for this woman. Now, I'm sorry, her name has slipped my mind, but we can certainly write that down. It's public knowledge. But an arrest warrant in the 1950s was actually, in the 1940s, was issued for her arrest. And the local sheriff basically buried it. The local sheriff said he couldn't find her, which was ridiculous. Right? And then hid the warrant. And his relatives, Emmett Till's relatives, only found this warrant about 3 weeks ago. And it's brought everything up again. And so she's still alive. So now they're pushing for her to be charged under the original warrant, because the state made the decision to arrest her and charge her, and they didn't. So the argument is she should be brought to justice now. But again, I think the state's really dragging their heels on it, unfortunately. But anyway, this has all come up recently. But anyway, Emmett was taken from the house at gunpoint. He was tortured over several days. He was mutilated, and he died of his injuries after, I think, about 3 days. And then he was thrown in a river with a heavy weight, and his body was recovered a few days later. And his mum, and I think she absolutely did the right thing. She chose to have an open coffin so that everyone would see what had happened to her son. I think that was a very brave choice. And that it's been said that the Emmett Till, what happened to Emmett Till, helped spur on the civil rights movement in the US. Yeah. So, I mean, there was a lot going on, and there were a lot of different influences there. But anyway, that's the very sad tale of Emmett Till, and it's not alone. He's not alone. It's just it was more publicised than most, and the fact that it was the 1940s and there was photographic evidence, and the mum had the open coffin so we could see. Remember, this is a 14-year-old boy, and it's stuck. And the fact that she's still alive, and the fact that they both got off and so forth, people remember. And as I said, it'd be interesting to see what happens now that this warrant has turned up, that some of his relatives, I guess a couple of generations down the line, have spent a lot of time going through the paperwork, from the old police files, and they've turned up this warrant. Apparently written on the back was "couldn't find her." Yeah. So anyway, that's I think we went off the topic there, but Paul,
sure.
And that's really topical at the moment. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens. They've been the media has approached her again, and again she's declined to comment recently. Yeah. Okay, so the next one in the Declaration of Sentiments, he has denied her the facilities for obtaining a thorough education, all colleges being closed against her. I don't think that's true.
Yeah, this doesn't sound right.
No. There were women's, I mean, historically, most societies have given men and women, if not the same education, very similar educations, and certainly the same level of education. There were often some of those differences in terms of the exact education, and particularly English-speaking societies have given women extensive education that was very much a function of their class. So upper-class women got largely the same education that upper-class men did. So aristocratic, women in
even if there were a bit of a bias against women, supposedly, all colleges, really?
That's right, exactly. That's right. And there's one actually called Beaver College that is and it's recently changed its name actually. Arcadia University, there you go, is the new name. But Beaver College, formed until recently Beaver College, was, there we go, this is interesting. I knew it was founded in the 19th century. Apparently it was founded in 1853. So it was founded 9 years after this. So I would suggest that if it was only 9 years after this, that people were probably thinking along the lines of founding those sort of institutions, and it may not have even been the first one of its type. But there you go. As far back as 1853, there was a women's only school for higher education.
Right.
Yeah. It was only 9 years after the Declaration of Sentiments was written.
Absolutely, yeah. So that last one was a complete fake.
Exactly. I think, and there were no doubt there were others, and there were women who were allowed into universities going quite back in not just in the US but in England and so forth. Particularly women who were particularly capable intellectually and so forth were given good education. I said aristocratic families would educate their sons and daughters. It was considered to be among the aristocrats of, say, someone like England, aristocratic women were expected to be able to converse with their husbands on an equal level. That was actually the requirement. So the idea that they got a significantly poor education just doesn't wash, because otherwise, how would they be able to confer with their husbands on that equal level? And just like with Mary Raby, there were many women who assisted their husbands in business, and when their husbands were away, ran the business, and when their husbands died, continued to run the business. He allows her in church as well as state, but a subordinate position, claiming apostolic. Sorry,
apostolic.
Apostolic. Thank you. Authority for her exclusion from the ministry, and with some exceptions from any public participation in the affairs of the church. Well, yes. Well, the Catholic. But it's a church matter, isn't it?
Right.
The Catholic Church and most of the other churches in Europe, yes, have maintained only male priests and bishops and so forth until recently. But yes, I would just suggest that's a matter for the church. So,
Well, with regards to the state, my objection here. If this were true, why is the expression "power behind the throne" a thing?
Mm.
You know,
That's a good point, actually. That's right. As well as the many women who have participated as leaders in their own right, which is well documented, which I talk about in the book a lot. There's also soft power, and women have always exerted soft power in those sort of roles. I mean, imagine you're the queen, you're the wife of the king, you have the king's ear all the time. You're most likely sleeping in the same bed with him, as long as they're getting on all right. You're sleeping in the same bed. She's got plenty of opportunity to put ideas into his head. Now, an interesting example of this actually may come from the US. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, of course, a lot of people, I think probably most Americans would know, he was elected president 4 times.
Yeah,
because at the time it was.
Don't I know? Yeah.
What was that? Sorry.
Don't I know? Yeah.
Yeah. So at the time it was only a convention about 2 terms. Now, of course, it's an amendment. So, but he was elected 4 times, and he died early in his 4th term, and he was already sick, but he had a stroke, I think late in the 3rd term or something. Some people have argued, some historians have argued, that his wife, some people have called her the first female president, because apparently the argument is late in FDR's presidency, he basically became unable to function as the president. And his wife just started giving orders to all his offsiders, and they just started following them. It's never been confirmed, but there seems to be some circumstantial evidence that was the case.
Can we blame her for the Japanese internments?
Good. I think maybe that was a bit early. I suspect that was earlier.
Okay.
That may have to fall to FDR. Yeah, I don't know for sure actually. But yeah, that's an interesting one actually. Yeah. But I mean, she certainly, if that's the case, she was certainly continuing those policies. But yeah, it's interesting that argument about her being the power behind the throne, as it was.
Yeah, sure. Like kind of a bit of a tangent. Going back to using gender as kind of a argument, like a collectivist kind of talking point, I suppose. Back then, the Yellow Peril, I think it was. A lot of the propaganda surrounding that is about about Japanese women coming for the white women. Basically, there's a lot of propaganda like that.
You're absolutely right, and we had that here too in Australia. Australia, of course, is a predominantly Anglo-Saxon nation on the edge of Asia. Australia, as you probably know, had the White Australia policy. So a lot of people don't know the White Australia policy only began in 1901, because before that, Australia was made up of a bunch of colonies, and the colonies had their own rules, their own immigration policies, and quite frankly, they didn't get on to a large degree. It was very hard to get them to agree on anything. Australia notoriously has 3 different gauges of railway because of this inability of the 19th century colonies to agree on anything like a standard gauge for railway. So a lot of people don't know the White Australia policy. I don't know, had you heard of the White Australia policy, by the way, Vernon?
I don't think so. No, that's
okay. No, so right. So what happened was Australia. I mean, this is really quite probably a bit of a dirty version, but Australia had fairly significant immigration from Asia in the 19th century during the gold rush. Also, too, a lot of people don't know, Australia actually brought in people from Afghanistan to basically teach them how to live in the desert. And they brought camels, and not just from Afghanistan, but they brought a lot of people from Afghanistan and they basically taught Anglo-Australians how to live in the desert. A lot of people also don't know that the first mosque in Australia was actually established in the 19th century because of the Afghans who came here. And they lived here. They settled and they were given permanent residence. They settled and their descendants still live in Australia today. But anyway, so by the late 19th century, Australia was quite worried about being on the edge of Asia, and it was and the populate or perish was the byline. And so in 1901, they instituted something called the White Australia policy, where they restricted essentially non-white immigration. The way they did it was really sort of interesting. The way but anyway, that continued right into the 1970s. But anyway, getting back to sort of bring it more on topic, you're absolutely right. It was to a large degree about this fear of Asian men coming in and essentially slaughtering the Anglo-Saxon men and, marrying the local women. That's pretty much what it amounted to. Yeah. One of the ways the White Australia policy worked was that they, and it may not have been the only thing they did, but they could require anyone coming into Australia to recite the Lord's Prayer in any European language, but nowhere in the legislation did it say it had to be a language you could speak. So if they didn't like you, they could just ask you to speak the Lord's Prayer in a language you couldn't speak, allowing them complete control over who could come into Australia. That's one of the ways they did it. And they didn't just use it against people from Asia. There was a notorious, there was a case where a European academic, they didn't like this guy, and they decided they didn't want him in Australia, and they kept asking him to. They asked him to say the Lord's Prayer in some, I don't know, some might have initially been German or something like that, and he did. And they asked him another one, and apparently they had to ask him 12 times before they found the European language he didn't know. And they could keep him out. So that's how they did it. Anyway, one of the ways they did it. Yeah. Because this guy was obviously I think it was the way the story was related to me, it was an obscure Welsh dialect that they found he didn't speak. And they were able to ask him to speak the Lord's Prayer in it, and he couldn't. No, you're not coming in. So that was repealed even in the 1970s. So, but yes, it was absolutely, it was all about that, about that fear.
What did you say this was? The White Australia policy?
It's called the White Australia policy. Yeah. And it was only repealed sometime around the time I was born. And it's interesting. It's interesting that Australia has demographically changed significantly since the White Australia policy was repealed. I mean, in the 1970s, Australia brought in a lot of immigrants, refugees from Vietnam. That was probably among the first significant, absorption of immigrants or refugees from anywhere other than Europe. And so, there's a lot of people who survived the Vietnam, or who had to flee from the Vietnam War, were brought in. And so it's interesting. Australia's quite a different place now than it was, say, when I was, growing up. So in terms of much more multicultural society now, at least in terms of ethnicity, very tolerant society. Unfortunately, like most Western societies, there's a growing intolerance in regards to gender.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But it's interesting. It's interesting how they did it, and how a lot of people don't know. I know it's probably quite off topic, but it's interesting just how in the 19th century it was a very different situation, and there were quite a lot of Chinese people came from China during the gold rush and so forth, so there's been a Chinese community here since that time, been an Afghan community since the 19th century. So, yeah.
Yep.
So let's see. The next one is, he has created a false public sentiment by giving to the world a different code of morals for men and women, by which moral delinquencies which exclude women from society are not only tolerated, but deemed of little account in man. That's interesting.
Again, finger pointing,
Yes.
It says,
and I would suggest, so Western civilization has argued that women are morally superior to men since at least the Middle Ages. This is something that Peter Wright talks about a lot on gynocentrism.com. So really good site. I think you could call it an allied site of A Voice for Men. Peter is active within A Voice for Men as well, but he has his own site, gynocentrism.com. Well worth reading in terms of a lot of the historical information that he's dug up. I've been absolutely amazed by some of the pieces that he's found. But anyway, so he makes the argument about the rise of gynocentrism in Europe in the Middle Ages, and also the fact that this parallel of women being viewed as morally superior, which of course I think that's kind of what they're saying. They're saying the same thing. They're saying, well, women are viewed as morally superior, so men are. We don't expect as much of men, and so they can get away with these things. But I would say that's from the male point of view. I mean, a lot of people still view women as morally superior, and that's something I absolutely disagree with.
Of course.
And feel that men and women should be held to the same moral standard.
Yeah. Same accountability, same agency.
Exactly.
Yeah. You just know that the women aren't going to like that.
That's right.
Accountability.
It requires. That's right. And then of course you have the same accountability in the courts and the justice system. So, for example, because it's absolutely documented that women get an easier time right through the so-called justice system. if anyone interested in that, look particularly at the work of Sonia Starr at the University of Michigan. She's done some great work both on in an American context, but both on differences of ethnicity, how the courts deal with people of different ethnicities, but also different genders. And she found that the difference for gender was significantly greater than the difference for ethnicity, 6 times greater, actually. And so men were treated 6 times worse relative to women, say African Americans were relative to white Americans. And the next one, he has usurped the prerogative of Jehovah himself. Wow. Claiming it as his right to assign for her a sphere of action when that belongs to her conscience and her God. Gosh, not quite sure where to go with that one.
Right.
I think they're saying that men are essentially dictating, I don't know, actions of women, when she's saying that should have they should draw the guidance for their actions from the Bible. I don't know. I think that's a big call, really.
It is.
Yeah, usurping the Bible, essentially. I don't know. It seems what she's saying, or what they're saying.
Right. Well, if I were to offer more of a modern kind of a counter to that, it's that, well, in many cases, there are women in the Christian world that deny kind of any kind of sex or contact to someone who isn't Christian, and even then it's going to be held back until after they get married. And I always thought of that as a way to kind of lure men into the woman's religion.
That's interesting. You think that?
Yeah, it's a bit of a hot take, but that's kind of how it seems sometimes,
So it is really interesting because, I mean, up until decades ago, we could see, say, the Christian church, along with other religious groups, arguing against sex before marriage, right? What I find really interesting is that research seems to have shown that Middle Ages Europe, sex before marriage was actually pretty common.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they had a concept called hand fasting, and essentially it was kind of like an engagement. And generally speaking, once a young couple got engaged, and the engagement was considered to be essentially unbreakable without a good reason. There were some reasons why you could break an engagement, but to a large degree, once you got engaged to someone, that was meant to be, meant to be unbreakable. Mm-hmm. Anyway, a lot of young couples started having sex once they were engaged, mm-hmm. and this was fairly common. And if we look at, for example, William Shakespeare, his wife was Anne Hathaway. I've made a few jokes over, that about her and having the same name as, a recent A-lister. But Anne Hathaway was pregnant when she married William Shakespeare, and it's been estimated that at the time around a third of brides were pregnant on their wedding day. Yeah, showing that sex before marriage was actually very common in Middle Ages Europe. There's also another case, and I have mentioned these in interviews recently, but I can't recall whether it was one of our discussions or not. But there was a case that's mentioned of a young man and woman who are going at it in the hay, and this guy this older man grabs the young boy by the collar and hauls him out and sort of tells him off, and the young boy protests that they're getting married the next day, and that was that. It was okay there, that was. So, carry on, Yeah. I don't know if it was quite like that, but it was much more acceptable. Maybe they weren't in love with the idea, but it was tolerated.
Right.
Yeah. So it's interesting that, given that probably the late 19th century and early 20th century saw a lot of people the great negativity towards sex before marriage, even among people who are engaged. But in actual fact, in Middle Ages Europe, which was a deeply Christian society, it was actually quite common. So. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah, so it's the kind of thing that just transcends the common mores that someone's trying to push on people. I think that's just the way it seems. I'm not trying to be unkind to the Christians or anything like that, but it's sex, just no matter what people think about it, it's just unstoppable.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And sex. I like to point out, each of us is the end result of 1 billion years of sexual reproduction.
Yep.
That is an enormous selective pressure to try to overcome. And feminism is anti-intellectual, and one of the ways you see this is in their denial of these sorts of basic concepts. I mean, sex is we are predisposed towards evolving a sex drive because we are descended from people who had sex in order to reproduce. So there's a natural desire to have sex and reproduce. So, and feminism has increasingly in recent years simply tried to deny all of that for a variety of reasons. But one other point I wanted to mention, I don't know what your thoughts are while we're on this topic.
Sure.
The modern Christian church and feminism. Looking as an outsider for the Christian church looking in, it seems to me, and I've heard this from a lot of Christians actually, as well as others, it seems that the feminism has really embedded itself in a lot of Christian churches, and certainly gynocentrism has, and there's a lot of ideas that come out about this, or a lot of things that are going on in Christian churches seem to revolve around feminist concepts, when perhaps even they might go against Scripture.
Probably, yeah. Well, an expression that keeps coming up to mind is keeping up with the Joneses. Basically, it's not just feminism, but all kinds of, adapting to the cultural norms, kind of reading the room, right? Because like this doesn't really have anything to do with feminism, but one thing I've noticed is how Christian youth groups have kind of evolved. It's really trying to be, for lack of a better term, hip, I suppose. It's trying to be more appealing to the younger generation, and not saying everyone does this, but it's like they're always trying to read the room and seeing, trying to see who to appeal to. Like, again, this is not really about feminism, but during my time playing in a band in Florida, sometimes we inevitably play gigs in like church venues, and they're run by the youth groups who themselves, the youth pastor that over there would have their own band, and it is really kind of appealing to the demographic that they're preaching to. So it's like I just wanted to point that out. It doesn't really have anything to do with feminism or the subject at hand. It's just a commentary on the fact that there's a lot of adaptations happening in churches that I guess depending on what kind of traditions you follow, you might not be immediately aware of. So.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, actually. And so, given the prevalence of feminism in modern society, you're arguing that it's been natural for them to adopt some of those concepts in order to try to stay relevant. Yeah, that is a really good point, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
And it's just true. It is true that church attendance is falling throughout the West and so forth. So I can see it's certainly a rational thing for them to try to do, to adapt.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah, but I think what troubles me, and I say this as an outsider looking in, but it seems to me that if you believe that the Bible is the Word of God, whether that's inspired or whatever it happens to be, that it ought to be the case that if something goes against Scripture that you would reject it. But it doesn't seem to be that way. At least that's the way it seems to me. There's stuff getting in there, which is, even stuff like, and I'm not expressing a personal opinion on this actually, but even stuff like having female priests, for example. I mean, there are biblical. The reason that Christian churches have male priests is because they interpret the Bible as suggesting that that's what God wants. I've read some of those passages, and some of them do seem to say that. So, whether or not, like, that's a separate argument whether I think that's appropriate or not. But if you're going to follow that, it seems to me that if it says it in pretty plain language, that is it really okay to then? I mean, how far can you just sort of reinterpret the Scripture? I listened to some. I have quite an interest in history of religion and so forth. I listened to some podcasts about this. There's one called Religion for Breakfast, and he actually maintains that religion is reinterpreted in the context of the culture in which it exists. And I'm not denying that. But I would have thought that that wouldn't be the way you would be supposed to do it.
Sure. Well, the distinction I'm thinking about right now is like, well, something like Catholicism, which is kind of more based on, in your words, outside looking in, more of an absolutist kind of universal kind of declaration, like, and anything that kind of falls outside of that is what they would call heresy. And then there's other denominations that have sprung up almost in reaction to the Catholic Church that, relatively speaking, are more individualistic than that, I think. I say relatively speaking because it's not fully individualist. It's kind of geared towards certain goals and certain endpoints, but my point still stands, I think. So, I guess it's one interesting I want to point out about Christianity is that apparently the term Christianity is relatively new in terms of the common usage, because before then it was something like Catholic or Protestant. So the denominations were more stressed, and the distinctions were more absolute. I think that's kind of my understanding of what's been going on. It's been more attempts to unite the different Christians. That's how the term Christian became more prevalent in use. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's what's been happening.
No, that actually sounds, I see what you mean. I hadn't heard that before, but that actually sounds right. So yeah, it's not that the term Christian didn't exist, but it's now more emphasized over, say, the denominational. That kind of does make sense when historically in Europe, certainly there were quite strict barriers between the different denominations. If you look at, say, the Western Christian churches versus the Eastern Orthodox churches, and they have in recent years, you're right, tried to be more unifying in their. It could be too. I guess they've lost power, so there's more of an emphasis there to unify with the other Christian churches. Yeah.
Sure, yeah.
No, that's a good point, actually. Yeah. So where's more? Yeah, you're right. People would be more about being. Let's say they're a Catholic or they were Russian Orthodox or something like that.
Right. True.
Yes.
We got one more sentiment left.
We do. Yeah. He has endeavored in every way that he could to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life. Abject, gosh.
Life is hell.
I tell you what, over the last few, I'm a history buff, but over the last probably 3 to 4 years that I've been researching the Victorian fallacy, I've come across more and more examples that would simply show this is untrue. I think, again, I came back to Mary Raby, who I've just written the article about. She was respected in the community. She was a business leader. She had a responsibility over the important school and so forth. She was capable, and she was respected in her community. And it simply wasn't the case that there any attacks on her self-respect because she was a woman, or leave her to a dependent, abject life. Nothing of the sort. And there are, throughout history, all around the world, you can find examples of powerful women standing on their own and being the top of the totem pole, as it were. Every society has done this. So I just think they're making that up as they go along. So anyway, only 100 of the 300 people who were present were prepared to put their name to this.
Yeah.
Yep.
All it took was a third.
What's it, sir?
All it took was a third.
Exactly. That's right. And it has. There we go. And actually, the 100 names are actually listed there. There we go, on the Wikipedia page, which I will be copying over to Wiki for Men.
Yeah.
Excuse me. The two sites use the same license, so we can transfer information freely between them. They both use same Creative Commons license, CC by SA, which means you're welcome to copy information out of Wikipedia or Wiki for Men and put it on your own site and modify it and re-release it and so forth. But all that is required, you've got to comply with the requirements. But one of the main requirements is that you cite the source you attribute it. So as you'll see on any articles we've got on there, we've copied information from Wikipedia. We make it very clear that information came from Wikipedia and give people the ability to track back to comply with the license. Well, there we are.
Yeah.
Declaration sentiments.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we close off today, because we've run about an hour and a half already now, so that went pretty organically.
Time flew, exactly.
Yeah. So as we were recording this episode, I actually sneakily posted a question to Twitter. Any questions for us? And we got one. We actually got a question for us to talk about. So this is by Peter Wright. We talked about Peter Wright today. How about a discussion of how the Randian approach helps to empower men to swap some gynocentrism with healthy selfishness? A coherent, simple breakdown might be of benefit to listeners. Now, this seems addressed more to me because I'm the resident objectivist in the men's movement. but did you have any thoughts on that first before I speak my piece on it?
No. So when he talks about Randian, I assume he's talking about the work of Ayn Rand.
Yes. Yeah.
Yep. No worries at all. No, I'm interested in what you have to say on it.
Okay. Well, I think so we've been talking about the Bible, and I noticed that a lot of red pill community people kind of cite the Bible as like the big red pill book, right? I offer this is not me saying that I'm against that idea, but I offer another choice, and that's The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. If anything, it encapsulates what is the core of what we call red pill, or even a man going his own way, because this is about a man basically standing at first alone on his principles, and eventually kind of rising to the success he did just by never compromising his values, basically. And in the book, it's the context of architecture, of course, not copying the old kind of styles that everybody just kind of wants to just keep on making, like the pointless pillars, and like the fake Greek kind of thing where it doesn't even belong in a metropolis. So it's basically about putting his own vision of architecture and actually succeeding in the end by standing his ground and not bowing, not allowing any compromises. It's comparable to a Frank Lloyd Wright in the real world, basically. And it's like he faces a lot of challenges. It's like, you need to put this compromise. We're going to compromise these values, but then you get to architect a building for us. Yes or no, Mr. Rourke? And it's a struggle for him, but he ultimately says no each time this is posed. Accept it my way or not at all. And that is ridiculously important. I think that I'm not sure is said enough in the men's rights, the red pill, and the MGTOW communities. I mean, I think some people kind of cite the work of Rand, but in my opinion, it needs more serious attention brought to it, I think. Basically, because gynocentrism is something I'm kind of going on. So sorry to interrupt anything you might say here, Robert, but I've kind of started out defining gynocentrism as the demand of male altruism, basically. And altruism is not, in my mind, compassion, but rather existence for the sake of others, never yourself. And basically a declaration that to serve self is evil, basically. And and gynocentrism would be women as the endpoint. You as a man, it's evil if you serve yourself as men, basically. So there are some parallels here that I think could be had from the normal argument from individualism, basic egoism against altruism, and basically man's right to exist for his own sake and go his own way versus living for the expectations of women and service to women.
Good point. I've never thought of it that way, but I think you're right. There is a parallel there, isn't there? Absolutely, in terms of that, about men are expected essentially to be selfless and to give and to die for the community. And you're right. They're actually it's a type of enforced altruism, isn't it? Yes, absolutely. Yeah. The other thing I was going to say is you mentioned about how we should talk more about I've forgotten. There we go. I lost my train of thought. But
Rand's work, or
yes, about no, I lost it. That's okay. I'll come back to it later.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, that's all right.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, the one thing that's closest that I've seen something like that in the men's movement, it's just the term going galt. I think that's the one
Yes.
I've seen actually, and it's actually in Wiki for Men too. Awesomely enough, basically the idea of going galt is just checking out of oppressive society and their norms and kind of doing your own thing. Basically, that's the general idea of going galt. Basically. Any kind of attempt to break away from the grid, as it were. And in the financial world, I think Bitcoin is a bit of an equivalent of that.
It's not regulated by a government. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I guess I really do think that the idea of MGTOW and going galt, they're pretty much the same, I think. Like in the Atlas Shrugged book, there's a bit of a science fictional element in which there's like an untouchable area where everybody checks out and goes into, and and they start their own free society, basically. I mean, but it could be applied in more everyday terms. Just be yourself. Stop being a part of the expectations of others. Just live free.
Yes.
I think, so it's much more simple than just, there's been failed attempts to kind of have societies that are somewhat inspired by the going galt thing, but, I don't really count them. I think they're just bad ideas. But that's what I wanted to say on that one.
No, that is, I like that actually. And I thought, I recall the point that I was wanting to chat about, that you mentioned about in the men's movement that we need to talk more, or we need to emphasize more not compromising. I absolutely agree.
Yep. I
think it is there implicitly. Certainly, I remember that was the impression, learning about it years ago when I was getting involved, that there was definitely an undercurrent that we aren't going to compromise, that our principles and so forth. So it's there. That I do think you're right. We don't talk about it explicitly enough, and I think it's a very good point. We should. That was actually just the point I wanted to make.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And more so on the idea of selfishness. It's pretty predictable. Being an objectivist, I'm for being selfish, but what that means is not parasitism. It's not feeding off of others. That's the objectivist view on selfishness. And I know selfish, that term kind of gets thrown around. Everybody throws it around, because if you're not serving me, then you're selfish, right? But but with regards to kind of critiquing women as selfish in the men's movement, well, these women are living secondhand, basically, off of the men that they parasite off of. So it's not selfish in the objectivist sense. I'm not here to kind of police everybody's language here or anything like that whenever they use the term, but I know what you mean, but
you're going more for a technical definition, I think.
I think what I think is the true definition, and it's partly based off of everybody else's sentiment, because you know who Ambrose Bierce is? He's a bit of a satirist, right? And he has this thing called the Devil's Dictionary. And it's about some satirical definitions of certain words. And one word that was hilarious was one definition was hilarious was the selfishness one. It was devoid of concern for the selfishness of others. So
I hadn't read that one actually. I like
right, yeah. But it's an entertaining book. But there's a bit of a hypocrisy, and there's a bit of an anti-self sentiment, and I think what the men's movement cannot afford is the attack on the self. We've got to start advocating for men's self-interest instead of how altruistic men should be, and defining masculinity based on those terms, based on sacrifices, and how much you lose and how much you give to others, instead of just living your own life, because that's what the objectivist version of selfness is. So sorry.
I think it's been there, but it's been implicit and an undercurrent rather than being explicit. But you're right, absolutely.
Yeah, selfishness is a very dirty term.
Well, like an example I look at is, okay, so a man risking his life now. in my view, parents, not just men, but it is right for parents to protect their children and even to risk their own lives for the safety of their children and so forth. Yes, I think men should do that. And I also think the women should do that, right? So, but what about being called upon to protect the rest of the society? Well, as I've said, I think that if the society deems that it must be protected and that it's a responsibility of its citizens to do that, that all able-bodied citizens have to bear that responsibility equally, right? But in this, I've been toying with these ideas of to what extent should a man be willing to give up his own life, and should he do it for his own family, for the protection of his own children? Absolutely, yes. That's what it takes. But for the wider society, well, only in my view, only in the context of the entire body politic having to do it, not just men. The problem I have is that men were expected to do this rather than able-bodied adults.
Right. Now, here's the thing about risk and sacrifice. Now, they're all responses to impending death. The death is not optional in this point, right? So it's like a force of nature almost, or somebody that, it intends to destroy you tyrannically. So this is not an ideal situation. It's only risk, and where necessary, the sacrifice comes in where, it's basically your hand is being forced, so you have to make a decision. So there is the right thing to do in that situation above others. If you value your child, yes, you protect them, because that is what we categorically consider is in your self-interest, because it is not in your self-interest to just let your baby die. That's just the way we say it. But my criticism about the worship of like the death of whoever, especially men, is that the risk itself becomes the virtue. Like the tragic impending situation becomes the ideal situation by which the following actions of sacrifice becomes measured. I don't know if I'm being clear about this. It's I don't really get a chance to talk about this so often. So.
I think it's something. I think I'd like, because we're obviously getting close to the end now. I think let's talk about this in the future, and also too, why don't you write some articles along that line, and even put something on Wiki for Men along those lines?
Yeah, sure. That's something I definitely do. In fact, I got my start off in the men's movement by an article about the objectivist case for the men's movement, and that one was apparently good enough to get me into ICMI the first time. But it was published in A Voice for Men. But I think it's been almost 2 years now. I think it's kind of down. Maybe if anybody wants to rehash it, that'd be fine with me. But that's something I like to talk about more. It's a bit of a touchy subject because most people don't like to think that the idea of the self is kind of a noble thing, I suppose, but I don't know, maybe I'm making a blanket statement. I don't know, but
well, you can be very clear with your definitions too, and say, well, this, I'm using the word selfishness, but I'm using this specific definition or something along those lines. So by all means, I'd say, do it. And if people don't like it or they're not happy about it, well, they can write a counter argument. We've done that before. We've actually had people debate on the site in articles a few times. So who knows, maybe something like that might be done. I have no problem with that at all. And on Wiki for Men, we can present those arguments, and if there are other arguments, we can present them as well and offer evidence. So
Sure. There's lots of stuff to be talked about on this one, so we can't fit them all here.
Let's talk about that. And I think the future, excuse me, it's getting late here. Let's talk about that in a future episode.
We'll definitely do that.
Well, shall we finish up? I think we have been going well over an hour and a half, haven't we? Yes.
And keep the questions coming, people.
Absolutely, that's right. Exactly. One of the cornerstones of men's rights is that we're not wanting to hide anything. Throw whatever arguments you want at us. I think people will find we're pretty good at making solid arguments in terms of being able to cite, supporting evidence and so forth. But by all means, we're never afraid for people to ask us any question. At the ICMI conferences, feminists come along, ask us questions, no problem at all. anti-feminists and non-feminists are often excluded explicitly from feminist conferences. We've seen this many, many times. There were some MRAs who were allowed to go to a feminist conference once, and they weren't allowed to speak most of the time. And I think they were allowed to ask one question, but they had to get the question pre-cleared. So that was a few years ago now. So very different outlook there. We're not afraid for people to challenge us, and they should.
Right. Yeah, comes with the territory.
Exactly, it does. That's right. If you really genuinely believe in your arguments, then you shouldn't be afraid to have them challenged.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much, Vernon.
Yeah, sure. 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
let's do it.
Talk to you then.
Mm-hmm.
Bye-bye.
Bye.